Hi, Elizabeth, Donovan, Shehnaz, Soni here. Elizabeth and I, we have known each other for almost 2 years now, and we got introduced by Sasha Stone. And Elizabeth comes with just wealth of knowledge. She is the author of Quantum Horizon. She is someone who basically navigates really well in the engineering world, and also at the same time navigates amazingly well in the medical world because of her background, being nurse, she's also expert with 3D printing. She can pretty much do anything and everything one wants to do in the lab and outside of the lab to create a project and to finish the project. So we have been talking about creating healing modalities. And Regenerative Bed is one of the ones that we both are very passionate about. We do realize that we can take one step at a time in order to create the bed that would look like an Elysium bed. However, we seem to have the right concept, right faculty, right understanding. And we're going to go through that in this session for whoever stumbles onto this video, because we're looking for investor, we're looking for a way to make this a reality. And we also, in the interim, are taking our baby steps to make sure that we can get somewhere. So that's where we are. And I welcome Elizabeth for this conversation. We're going to have some fun here. And so Elizabeth, go ahead and tell everyone a little bit more about you and what your vision is for the Regenerative Bed.
Oh, okay. Okay. So this is going back to a few of the prototypes that I've already done. And one of them, this back when I was discussing this with Mary Saul a few years ago, and she said, well, if the Bearden protocol works, why don't we build one? So I built something called the Axis, and the Axis basically was a specially doped crystal that was excited with two lasers from either side, which are called pump waves in Bearden's patent. So that's basically just a single handheld unit that was about that big, and so I had that for a long time, and then there was a dog that fell, more like jumped off the porch into the garden down below. Lots of contusions, abrasions, that sort of thing, torn ligament, and so took him to the vet, and the vet said that, yeah, I mean, there's a torn ligament there. So we thought, okay, well, let's treat him with that to see if it's going to help him. And they said, well, if he's not putting any weight on it in the next couple of weeks, then we have to surgically repair it. So first treatment, and it was interesting because it seemed like he knew it was helping him. And I could feel that there was a kind of warmth spreading down. And when you take a look at what's happening with this crystal rod, there's a shimmering that's going on. And when you contact that with the skin, you can actually see the shimmering effect spreading into the skin. And I mean, it's kind of unnerving to see it to begin with, but after a while, you get used to that. It's like there's some kind of energy that's going in there. Now, in the Bearden provisional patent, he just talks about a type of time reversal energy that's being used. But I think there's more than that going on with this shimmering effect.
Yes, and I want you to take a pause on that because, I wonder if it is connected with the, the luminescence, right? The luminescence that we have because we are crystalline being. And connected with, because, I actually was studying the pineal gland activation, which is a very important way to hold light in your body, because as I do teaching of the light body activation, and it was connecting the fact that because when you activate something like pineal gland, it creates a chemical reaction in a way that it doesn't do it on a regular basis. And that creates a certain chemical and certain molecule that ends up affecting your spectrum and what you see, like, because, we have a limited electromagnetic spectrum band based on where we are today. But when you activate something in your body where it's excreting fluid, now you have expanded your band of what you can see. And that could be the reason. Remember, you were saying that when you see the luminescence, like even when you were showing me the crystal on one of our calls, you said that it wasn't showing up on the Zoom camera. Like there was something blocking it. What was that?
I think what they did with all of the cameras is that they put a filter inside of them so that it doesn't register. Now, CCD chips rather, are sensitive to in the UV and the IR range.
Okay.
And our eyes actually have a wider range than now the webcams and the cameras do because they have the filters inside them.
That's true.
So what happens is that if you try to take a photo of it, if you have a later camera, that camera's got those filters in there. So it won't pick up the shimmering, which is occurring in this near UV and near IR region. And that's why we're talking about the dicyanin, because the dicyanin that's a bandwidth compressor. So it takes those two and pushes them together. And now, interestingly enough, there's some security cameras that don't have the filters. They're the older ones, which is something that I have here. And I have one that's mounted in the lab, and you could actually see the little orbs about that big zipping around. So, I mean, they're around. I mean, you can, it's in
It's just a matter of
range.
seeing
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
That's pretty
And
cool.
you can't see them with invisible light, but in the UV and the IR, yes, you can. So
That's an interesting thing. And you know, thanks to you, I have our Aura goggles now, and it's interesting because it feels like it just blocks the sunlight. You know, from as soon as you wear it, everything becomes dark. But the outside looks so beautiful with the sky, and just the colors are like really gorgeous, like it's purple, and I just like it. So every now and then I wear it. But that is one way for us to expand our band, right? So that we can see things. We can basically just like that Star Trek. Oh, you got yours as well? Good job.
yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So we'll have to probably do that experimentation on that. So going back to the Regen bed, right? So, so the vision is very similar to the Elysium bed. And what I'm going to do is I'll share the screen, and then Elizabeth, you can speak to it, because let's go ahead and dive into it. So actually, we're going to go through this.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, so do you want to go through, give a little intro, and then we'll go through the practical region, because that's what we're going to do. So this one, you go straight here, actually. And
so, and now this is a larger version of what we're calling the axis. And the axis, it's, and to finish up the story about Marisol's dog. So after the third or the fourth treatment, he was not only putting weight down on the leg, he started walking around with it. So we took him to the vet to see what was going on. And the vet said, oh, you had it repaired already, the ligament. I said, no, I mean, we didn't do anything like that. And he said, but all the contusions are healed. And then he looked at it and he said, oh, there's no stitch marks. I said, yeah. Then he says, I don't want to know what you did.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Stitch mark, what does that mean? Like
that means, well, if you have surgery, then you basically, you have a suture mark.
Right.
I mean, that's a scar.
Right.
And he didn't have any scarring. None. It all healed without scarring.
So that is what is similar to what we're saying, that it pretty much resets it back to the previous state.
Yeah.
That is why it's not like that the way we do it now, right? So that is where it gets differentiated, which is like you were not, like you never had that disease, for example, you never went through it. So that's the reverse time and reverse entropy. Now, I wanted to ask you, Elizabeth, because you know these notes were taken a long time ago, but I want to make sure if it's still valid. When we're saying, because there's so many med beds out there, and when we're saying the Regen bed that you are envisioning using the Tom Bearton's patent is kind of more aligned with Elysium bed, right? Rather than the bed that was shown.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Now the difference would be that instead of a single arm, I would probably have two, and they would always be opposite one another.
Okay.
And so that would be the difference. So that we could do it that way, but I think to be more effective, probably would require two. Maybe the first prototype might look more like the Elysium bed to begin with, but later on it'll have 2 arms instead of 1.
Right.
And the reason being that these crystals are horribly expensive to buy. And what we're probably going to wind up doing is having a crystal growth furnace and growing our own. So,
Right.
so, yeah,
So this is your
yeah,
protocol, right? Access, which is what you were
right.
showing on the picture
Mhm.
there. And so, okay, so that is one of our constraint is that it's an expensive crystal. Crystal are expensive, so that's one of our constraint. And
Right.
of course, so the notes here is where the concept comes from, right? So
Mhm.
maybe
Sure.
you can, yeah, if you like to just get into it a little bit here, and then we'll
Sure,
go to
sure.
practical research.
So one of the things that happens is that whenever you have a negentropic effect, you also have a cooling effect at the same time. So that's one of the things that happens is it feels like there's a cooling effect inside the skin, which is really good if you have a burn for one thing. And burns tend to heal really fast with this thing. And so any kind of topical skin injury tends to work really well. Evidently, it works with ligaments as well. I suspect it would take longer for bones because primarily it's that far in from the body, and it would require more time for treatment. Now, the optical phase conjugation through the looking glass, essentially, how this thing started out with is that in optical networks, they have to use a special type of crystal. And this thing, essentially what it does is, oh yeah. So anyway, what it does is it removes the energy from the noise of the signal, because now if you have a fiber optic line, it's not completely transparent. All the wavefronts tend to eventually get distorted. So how this works is that it takes that distortion in the wavefront and it takes out the distortion as the energy of the distortion and the noise into the original signal, amplifying it. So it takes that entropy that from the degraded signal and actually adds it to the original signal while canceling out the noise. And then it just, it's like a repeater, it goes down to another node. But it's interesting that that's exactly what it does, is it gets rid of distortion. It's a distortion correction system. So what's disease? Well, disease basically is it's a distortion in the biofield. Now, if you have something that creates a distortion correction, then it would create distortion correction in the biofield as well. By biofield, I mean that's probably the most politically correct way of saying aura. So.
Oh, that's yeah.
Right. So I mean, it's there. I mean, it's there around the body. So one of the things that Robert Becker discovered is that red cells can de-differentiate into stem cells. Okay, well, how do they know how to create the DNA? Well, if you de-differentiate the cell, then potentially the information is inside the red cell to recreate the DNA. I mean, it's basically just getting time regressed back into a de-differentiated state. So it already has that information. So it turns into a stem cell. The stem cell goes to heal a bone fracture that re-differentiates into a bone cell. And then that's it. But it can also do the same thing with myelin, for example, with nerves or with other tissues that you wouldn't think normally can be healed. So I suspect that this is also going on, in other healing modalities. So
I just noticed, so because I know you're talking about distortion, and I wanted to make sure we can make it obvious that where is it being talked about. And I'm just looking at right here where like this whole paragraph is very interesting, by the way, because it talks about
Yeah.
that how, like basically, you're using the way, like you are changing the frequency and the direction right there with the third order term consists of a number of components, one of which is responsible for the polarizability changes used to generate the refractive index. So it's kind of like talking about how it's changing the distortion,
Right,
right? I mean, is that kind of along the same line what you're talking about?
right. And again, I mean, the phase conjugator, there's an entire class of them now. I mean, it used to be that it was just barium titanate that they knew about. And then they found out that quartz is a weak phase conjugator. It does work, but I mean, it takes longer for it to do what it's supposed to do. And then there's an entire class of different crystals that will do this. So we were experimenting with different types of crystal. One of them was it's one that they're normally using for reversing tattoos. So
Yes,
that's kind of interesting in itself.
that's the neo one, right? The neo.
It's the ND-YAG, you know that one?
Yes, yes.
Okay, but here's the weird thing about that is that you would think that, I mean, the ND-YAG was burning off the tattoo subdermally, but there was a video that showed that it was scanning over the tattoo and it was fading. I mean, it wasn't burning it off. It was like the tattoo was just, the ink was just disappearing.
Same thing what you said about the dog stitch being gone. So it's the exact same phenomena you're talking about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So the tattoo basically disappears. And okay, so what's the ND-YAG doing? Well, it's doing phase conjugation.
Okay.
It's reversing that or reverting that tissue into a state before the ink was applied.
Yes.
So the tattoo disappears. So that's really interesting in itself. Now, so this also means that it has a regenerative effect. That means that it can take. Someone asked me, well, what would happen with senescent cells that are basically past the Hayflick limit and can't reproduce anymore? We need to find out what would happen with those. I'm not sure, but I think what I suspect will happen is that it'll regenerate those cells back to a youthful state.
Right. So Elizabeth, to make sure that we don't lose our people here and myself, but I wanted to ask you, everything you were saying, doesn't the setup right here, the phase conjugate approach kind of on a high level has the setup, right, that you would want to do with the crystal? Because I'm looking at it,
Sure.
I'm reading about it, it looks like it's hitting exactly what you're saying. And this article pretty much is shedding the light on this concept. Now I want to go back to the picture that's much easier to understand because they're pictures is easier than words sometimes to explain the concept. I'd like you to explain this, all these four pictures from your perspective. What do you think is going on here?
Oh, okay. So one of the strange things about a phase conjugator is that if you look at a phase conjugate mirror, you're not going to see yourself because all the light that is coming out of the retinas of your eyes are returning there.
Okay.
In normal mirrors, the angle of incidence is the angle of equals the angle of reflection. Not so with a phase conjugate mirror. I mean, it always returns the light exactly back to the path that it came. So, and in the case of, I mean, Alice looking at, I mean, the mirror and it's reflecting from the backside. Okay, well, that's kind of artistic license, but, and that's kind of like almost like what would happen, but.
Yes, so that's what I'm noticing in all of these four mirrors, right? So let's go one by one. In all of these mirrors, they're not seeing what they should be seeing, right? So let's look at the cat. Cat is looking in the mirror, and then the only thing the cat is seeing. is the eyelid, right? So that's right. So what is the, so explain in your understanding, so what's the message? Because here the cat is seeing this, the eyelid,
Right.
here Alice is looking not the front part of it, which is what you would expect, but she's looking the back part of it. And then in the third one, the cat here has like her, the ear is like, bent, but in the mirror, it doesn't look bent. So it's also not showing the exact same thing. And then of course, in the fourth
Right.
scenario, that is where the biggest transformation occurs, which is what you're talking about.
That's the time reversal part, right?
Exactly.
Okay, now here's where things get interesting, because how does okay, if you're doing time reversal, what you're doing is you're quantum entangling with an earlier version.
Right.
So, and it's interesting in that case, because that's really what she's looking at, is an earlier version of herself.
Right.
So the question also became, if you had a really, really fast phase conjugator, could you do, like bodily regeneration, where you could regenerate tissues to the point where you could have regeneration clinic, for example. I mean, if you had a theoretical 1,000 to 1 ratio at 8,766 hours to the year, that means that would be 8.766 hours, for a year. So it means that now that means you could go to sleep, because you're really getting charged up with a lot of energy in this case. And with that amount of energy, it would be very pleasant, with things changing. So you'd be better off if you were unconscious at that point.
So you can process it better.
At that point, then, for the 8 hours that you're unconscious, then the body's regenerating 1 year. So, yeah, I could see that happening, sure. Fast phase conjugators and a lot of energy input. We know that the human body radiates about 5 watts worth of longitudinal wave energy. And you call it scalar, but it's 5 watts of energy.
Okay.
So that means that would be a lot of energy that you're inputting back to the body to run it backwards. Unless there might be a kind of a, in any kind of antenna, there's a Q, it's a quality, and any kind of resonance system, there's also a Q. There could be a Q in the regeneration system as well. So you might not have to input like 5,000 watts of longitudinal wave energy into the body. That's a lot of energy to put in.
Right.
If you had a really large Q, you might be able to regenerate the body with less energy. That's less shock to the system.
Right.
And we're talking about longitudinal wave energy, which is it's not really electromagnetic. It's longitudinal electromagnetic. So it's acting in a different way. So, but still, it's a lot of energy. So, and the Elysium bed, yeah, I think that we're going to get some surprises when we actually get into it. And you have to use your intuition when you're getting into a lot of these things, because your intuition is going to tell you one thing. Well, the theory that you're working with is telling you something else. So, okay, well, what's missing from the theory? Because, my intuition is telling me that there's something that's not there that we need to look at.
Right.
So we're going to get some surprises with this thing, like the Q coupling coefficient, that sort of thing.
Right.
And really large coupling coefficient, less energy needed, that sort of thing. So.
Okay. So going back to the concept part of it, right? So we covered the looking glass concept. We want to go into practical regions. So let's go in there.
Right.
And the goal is that we understand what we want to create. We understand what are the concepts behind it. We also understand what are the constraints. However, we do believe that it's a possibility, right? Which is why we are talking about all of this. So I'm going to just So actually, while we're talking about this whole thing here, and I'd like you to cover, Elizabeth, about bending spoon scene, right, from the Matrix, partly because I want, like in a way, this whole Elysium bed seems like almost like a fairy tale to a lot of people, because how can something like, how do you reverse time, reverse entropy, and bring something back to the original profile unless you're watching a Star Trek? I mean, generally that's how people understand it. So I want people to truly understand that there's a reason this is a possibility scientifically, right? So I want you to explain that, because mind is matter, which is what you say all the time. And in the Matrix movie, the whole spoon bending scene where the message was highlighted that there is no spoon.
There is no spoon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So please
Right.
elaborate that a little bit more.
Right. So, okay, this is going back to a discovery that was made back around the turn of the 21st century, is that they were going to photograph an electron in orbit. They could do that. I mean, they had, femto and attosecond lasers. So they tried that, and they didn't get that. And what they got was, somebody was trying to call me. So anyway, so what they got was something called a Beck gradient. It's a Bose-Einstein condensate gradient, and it's basically and they caught the electron in its wave state.
Okay.
So then they slowed it down, and they slowed it down again and again until they finally got the electron. Then they realized that 99% of the time the electron is in its wave state. It's not in its quantum state. So how would you do the spoon bending trick, for example?
Right.
Well, one reason that you could do that is because if it's spending 99% of the time in a quantum probability state, probability waves, you can actually input energy and then change the probabilities going on an atomic level.
Okay.
So if you can change those probabilities, and it doesn't take any energy to do that, you're just changing the structure. Once you're changing the probabilities in that structure, when it precipitates out as a quantum state instead of the probability state, that means that now essentially you're programming it to do what you want it to do, and you can bend the spoon.
Okay, so bending of the spoon is a quantum collapse. In order
Right.
to create that quantum collapse, as because there's a probability of the spoon to be bended, but there's also a probability of the spoon to be not bended, which is generally where we are always headed, which is why we don't ever see the spoon being bent.
Right.
So
right.
when you said that you're inputting in a way that you're reprogramming at the atomic level, what is the input parameter here?
Okay, this gets into the binding energy of the spoon itself and the atoms inside the spoon. So if you can change the binding energy inside the spoon, that's something Uri Geller was, they were testing what he was doing with it. They realized he was actually changing the binding energy of the metal inside the spoon. There are several patents that are out now where if you input the nuclear magnetic resonant frequency of a particular metal, you can actually increase or decrease the binding energy of that metal. You can actually cause it to liquefy at room temperature if you wanted to.
Okay.
Now, John Hutchinson is doing that in a kind of a mechanical way. Well, that's debatable too, because, I mean, his system doesn't work when he's not there. If somebody tries to repeat it, it doesn't work. But if he's there, then, I mean, the Hutchinson effect works. So it's something that it's only repeatable if you believe it's going to be repeatable.
Because believing in it becomes another input to the
right.
Because that is the thing where your intention affects your manifestation. And similarly, your observation affects your momentum, right? So there's all these parameters that are at play. But it's an interesting thing you said about having to change the binding energy through the you said through the nuclear magnetic resonance,
nuclear
right?
magnetic
So
resonance,
how do
right?
you create that? How do you create that? Because, I'm very interested in knowing that, because I was teaching a class, the light body activation, and one of the students mentioned about spoon bending class that's being taught at Monroe Institute. And I'm actually looking into it because, as my curiosity as a scientist and as a spiritual alchemist, I'm like, what is the deal here? So I want to see what they're teaching. But she was saying that they were teaching a methodology where at the end of the class, everybody was able to bend the spoon. So what I'm telling you is that that means we can create that input from ourselves,
Right,
through ourselves, to
right.
truly do that. And it's almost like an art there. And I think that it's connected with where we are headed with the regen bed. So just keep that in mind as we're going to keep on covering that. I'm going to take you back to the practical regen, which is what we want to cover.
Sure, sure.
So that way we don't put anybody to sleep just because we're having such an incredible conversation here.
Having too much fun otherwise.
I know, because me and Elizabeth can do this all day long, but we want to make sure that other people are actually
Sure.
getting what we want them to get from this. So I'm going to start sharing the practical.
Oh, by the way, the telekinetic part, that's also related to that.
Yep,
Because
cover it.
again, I mean, if you have like a coffee cup or something,
Right.
then I mean the coffee cup is staying where it is because all the momentum of the vibration of the product of the atoms inside the cup, I mean, it's all sum zero, so it just stays where it is. But now, if you can change the probabilities where the atoms of the cup are vibrating more in one direction than the other, then now you have momentum built up inside the cup, and then it can start moving. So, that's another thing. You can do telekinesis with that. You can do pyrokinesis, because if you could increase the vibration of an object, then you can actually change the temperature of the object as well. Ingo Swann did that.
Yeah.
So, right.
That is interesting. And like I know I've heard people who had certain brain condition going on, or they were experiencing something that was neurological, right? They were actually seeing the world differently by virtue of their experiences, where the whole world was not looking as dense as it does look to us, which means that they were doing the telekinesis, right? Or pyrokinesis. Right. They were affecting because we are a moving molecule. I always say that we are moving electrons, because that's truly what we are. But if you actually see, it seems like what you're saying is that when you input yourself, input into the equation of how you are perceiving this holographic universe, then it affects the very thing that you're seeing, and it breaks down the bond between them, or the binding energy or the binding frequency, and then you're able to see the object in the less denser form, which is why those changes occurred, right, in terms of bending speed and so forth. Just very interesting. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this journey down the rabbit hole.
Sure.
Practical regeneration, a study in healing and time. So this is a presentation that comes from Tom Bearden Notes that Elizabeth actually presented it in Lazarus Initiative, and we are actually going to go through it, where we will have a little question answer session, so we can make sense from multiple perspectives.
Oh,
So,
okay.
Go ahead.
So time is not an observable, and in fact, all we can do is we can measure time through motion. I mean, it's the motion of atoms, for example. It's the motion of the vibrations of a quartz crystal inside of a timepiece. So it's not a direct observable. So it has a scattering effect. That's positive time.
That is the reason we've experienced time dilation, right? That's the experience when you're about to have like a close call. Let's say you're driving a car, and you know that
time slows down.
Right. Like you feel in every core of your body that there's something going to bad happen if you don't do something to interject, right? Okay. Yeah,
and that's also, I think it's I think that we have a quantum entanglement going on, positive, forwards and backwards in time. And usually telepathy occurs during traumatic events. But if you have your own, if your future self is having a traumatic event and is connecting with your past self, now I think that feedback loop can produce deja vu, and it can also produce other effects where you realize something bad is going to happen, so you can change it. Well, I mean, at that instant, I mean, you're jumping timelines, and this is getting into the many worlds hypothesis.
Right.
But if you're jumping timelines to where that original traumatic event didn't happen, so now you have you essentially, well, it's a paradox in that case, because the original traumatic event now happened from a parallel timeline that well, it's still existing in a parallel timeline, but you've jumped to a different branch of space-time.
Right.
So it doesn't happen. So the original you that projected it back is still there having the traumatic event, but you're in a parallel timeline where that's not going to happen. So in a way, I mean, it's almost a survival tool, because what this is doing is, I mean, it's in some cases, I mean, if someone fell off a building, it's a way of escaping. It's a way of having like a parallel you in a different timeline that's escaping death, or certain death. And they say, well, and some people have said that they actually have experienced the other timeline, and the trauma of dying at that point, and then boom, all of a sudden they're there. I mean, in this parallel timeline where that didn't happen.
Right.
And
wow,
yeah.
this is touching so many things for me, right? Even mandala effect in a way, right? Because
yes, right? Exactly.
That's exactly what it is. In a way, you're reprogramming your trajectory in the fractal holographic universe. That's what you're doing. And I know a lot of therapists do that just to help you heal something by remembering something that was traumatic and taking the charge away from it by making it appear to be that it wasn't as bad as you remember, for example, just so that it can help you heal. And in a way, what you're doing is you're hopping timeline, right? Because there are so many possibilities.
Yeah,
there are so many possibilities of the same thing happening. The other thing I want to mention was that time is directly proportional to entropy, especially the linear time that everybody believes as past, present, future. That does correlate with entropy, which is we're headed in which is the reason aging occurs, right? Because that's how everybody perceives time, and that's how as you get older, then you should have more wrinkle. It's along the same line.
And
interesting.
Along those lines too, it's interesting that this is in the series in Transylvania Sunrise, the one that Peter Moon was doing with Radu Cinema. And I think it might be the second book. That's where they meet the alchemist, and he has this pendant that he's wearing. And as long as he's wearing it, okay, now there's such a thing as that's called self-pump phase conjugate systems.
Okay.
And you do have to have energy to self-pump it. But if it's taking that energy from the body to do that, then it's actually producing like a time reversal effect, where it's reversing it just enough so that it prevents aging from occurring.
Okay.
So that could be what some of these, and it's always a pendant that has either a kind of a purplish shimmering effect or a blue shimmering effect. And as with the axis, it's magenta in the case of the axis.
Oh wow. This shimmering, I have to connect this with Egyptian gods, right? I mean, didn't they have like the shimmering was one of their attributes and characteristics, like even the is it the eyes of the Horus? That is like it had that shimmering effect, right? And also, like, it's interesting because when you watch vampire movies, they actually show their skin shimmering too. Like there's something to do with the shimmering, like it shows the attribute of the species that is, it's another layer of the attribute is what I'm saying, right?
Sure,
and
sure.
it kind of does connect with the fact that luminescence is part of us too. And it could be that we could also shimmer. We just have to have a certain, composure within ourselves, right? To kind of activate that
Mhm.
shimmering effect in our bodies. And it could be that that gives you a little bit more characteristics to do more things with yourself because it makes you versatile in that sense, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, that just opens so many portals for me. Are you ready to move to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay. I love Walter Russell
Yeah.
and his
Okay.
words. So the inadequacy of the senses to record the backward flow of forward-moving things causes the illusion of sequence and time.
Mhm.
So pretty much he's saying the time is not linear, it's just the perception.
Right, it is. Yeah. Yeah, and it's not really a measurable item either. We're just measuring motion. So, yeah. Now, okay. Oh, yeah. It does not mean time travel, because what we're doing is we're returning it to its the state of least entropy.
Right.
So, and that's what happens inside of telecommunications. Now, you're taking the signal and returning it to its least state of entropy and then sending it along. And you could do that with matter as well.
Okay, so that's the same thing with the bending spoon phenomena then.
Right, right. The connection between the past self and present are made stronger. And it's done with a version, again, less entropy than the present one. The matter can reconfigure to that pattern. And it requires the connection. It's not so much as energy that's required as the connection.
Right, right. So
So,
basically you're
right,
returning the matter to its previous state via superimposition, via the version that has less entropy and decay. That's what you're doing here.
right, right.
So that's why the
And
disease, yeah.
right, and the disease can reappear later if your lifestyle hasn't changed. And for example, I mean, let's say that you've come over somebody that had lung cancer because they've been smoking too much. And then after that, they just take up the habit again and they're just doing the same thing. So they're going to have to be, that's going to have to be cured again over and over and over again until they realize that what they've done to themselves created that condition in the first place. So
Exactly.
consciousness is a part of that.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
Because if your input doesn't change, then your output doesn't change, right? If you keep on
Right,
keeping
right.
this lifestyle that has gotten you there, you can fix it, but then again, you're back. And that actually reminds me of one of my friends, she has been a CRNA and she's always working on heart surgeries. And she says that there are certain type of people who come for heart surgery and most of them are very obese and most of them have a certain lifestyle. And there are certain people that come for heart surgery and then they go back and then they come back again, same people. So that to me is quite a kind of like, that's where we don't want to have to do the same thing over and over again on the same person because we are truly not
Right.
helping. We're not healing, we're kind of enabling. So we want to create a complementary healing method like Elizabeth, you mentioned earlier. I love that word complementary healing because the idea is that not only you use the Regen Bed to help heal people, you also teach them how to maintain that level of healing so they don't keep recreating the very problem that got them in the first place.
Sure, sure. Okay. Okay, Antoine Priori. Oh, that's a big one. So, yeah, Antoine Priori, he had a machine that cured 99% of cancer in mice. But again, his mice appeared younger, but seemed to keep their memories. So I thought about this, and I think it's because our memories are like in an energy body that exists outside of normal time, which makes sense because if that's where it exists, then you can have multiple feedback and feed forwards going on. You can have your past self talking to your future self talking to your present self, and that sort of thing. And you can have feedback loops going on, giving you deja vu. So, yeah, and then changing the lifestyle and mental attitude can prevent reoccurrence. Oh, that's a must. Absolutely. Now, genetic reshuffling. Now, what that would mean is that if you have a predisposition for a specific disease genetically, then again, it's like hopping timelines. So what you would do is you would change the probabilities to where that genetic predisposition doesn't happen, because it's a probability.
That is true.
But,
and
right.
that kind of feeds all of the epigenetic, right? Because that is
Right,
the
exactly.
concept there.
Right.
So yeah, and I wanted to go back to the memory, because I actually have spent a few pages of my book on memory, because I was so intrigued by this part of the memory. And I kind of say intrinsic memory and external memory. So the memory that we store in our DNA, right? Because our DNA can store more than terabyte of information. They've already proven it scientifically that it can store actually billions and billions of years of history in our DNA, which is incredible that how much we can store. But that to me is an intrinsic memory, which is what remembers, like, you know, you're an autopilot, right? Just the way you move your hand, just the way you move your body, all of that information stored in the way your body moves, for example, like postural move, right? That gets stored in our DNA. But then the external memory, I would say, is the memory that you access based on which channel you're dialing in, which AM or FM radio you're tuning into. And based on that tuning into, you're tapping into the morphogenetic field and picking up the information that's pertaining to where you're tapping in. So that is how I kind of differentiate in the two memories, even though, you know, human is the conduit, right? And accessing both memories. However, you get to decide what you're accessing depending on what you're focusing on.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so optical phase conjugation, and that's the other thing. Okay, to natural human processes, I think this might be possible as far as, you know, the two pump waves.
Yes.
And so if one human being has a 5 watt and they can focus the 5 watt longitudinal energy through their hands, for example, has 2 antennas, then hands-on healing is possible.
Exactly.
So yeah, that can work as well.
Right.
So,
and hands-on,
yeah.
like Reiki, right? I mean, Jesus was healing people with his hands, which is very, right? He was even reviving human beings. So the hand does emit longitudinal waves, and you said that our body radiates 5 watts of longitudinal waves, right? So we are kind of a healing walking machine in that sense. And so in this particular slide, I think we already covered the Looking Glass article, which kind of goes very in depth into it. But the key point here is that if you do have a non-linear optical crystal, which is the one you're saying is a constraint because it's expensive, but that is the key for this regen bed in order for us to help set the body to the position where there was a less entropy, right? And the other thing that we're highlighting here is that memory does stay intact, which means that even though you are resetting the DNA to the profile when it was healthy, you are not compromising the stored information in the DNA that they have collected over time. So that way they can carry that wisdom as they proceed, because, you know, we store information, like, you know, how we say that as we age, we become wiser, and we don't want to take that away from the person, the wisdom part of it, but we want them to still look young and beautiful. So it's like having the best of both worlds is what you're saying.
Sure. So the energy body, and yeah, there's the hands-on healing, but the energy body can have, well, yeah, it's kind of like the difference between firmware and a program stored in RAM, because the DNA is more like the firmware, and then the energy body is more like what's stored in RAM. But the energy body, I think, can also, not exactly a good analogy, because the energy body can actually survive the death of the host. So that means that it can actually go on to another body. And then there have been instances where people have had scars on their body, like bullet wounds that happened from a probable, past incarnation. And when they were regressed, yeah, I mean, someone was shot in the back and they have what looks like a birthmark that looks like a bullet wound. So things like that.
So when you're talking about energy bodies, you're kind of touching a little bit on the auric field. One of the
Right.
things that Dr. Stuart Hameroff actually said, and I even quoted that in my book, where he was basically mentioning that a patient died right in front of him, and it was almost like when you die, for example, all your information gets stored in the energy bodies, which is kind of tethered to your physical body. So it's almost like your consciousness was downloaded to this etheric body.
It's a backup. It's kind of like you're backing it up to the energy
so that
body.
Depending on whether you die or whether you don't die, because some people have died and then they've been brought back alive, through the machines that we have, right? Like by giving them the CPR or whatever process people have used. And he was talking about this person who died in front of him, and then he came back to life, and it was almost like that he was, that information that was stored temporarily, right, in the etheric body came right back to him for him to continue his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and then there's also a story about how you could take the energy that's in the energy body and then entrap it in a crystal, like a crystal skull, for example. And the shamans in the old Aztec Empire were able to do that, allegedly. But what they would do is they would take the energy body on the termination of the physical vehicle, and then it would go into this crystal skull. And psychics that have been probing some of these skulls say, yeah, I mean, there's something alive in there, and it's probably the shaman. So
right. Yeah, and I actually had an interaction with Crystal Skull, and it does store them information at a mega level, right? Which is why, because if everybody comes in contact with the Crystal Skull, for example, and whatever they need from it, it's almost like it gets passed on to them because it becomes a point of convergence.
Right. Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah. I like it. Intent can act as a quantum potential into the past.
Right. So intent is very important in this case for the hands-on healing. It's a kind of a way of tuning in to a past self, so that it's not exactly pushing, but you're trying to steer that into that point in the past, using different.
Right. It's almost like the intent is causing the quantum collapse to choose the probability
right
serves it better, right? It's almost like just going back again with the bending spoon, right? If your intent is to bend the spoon, and if you put all your focus on that, right, then you can affect the atomic configuration of what's made of. It's pretty much that's how powerful we are.
Oh yeah, definitely. So
okay.
Ingo Swann did a lot of this work too, as well as Colagan and a few others. So yeah. Here we go. The CPT invariance. So, and that's charge parity time. Oh, by the way, they're trying to get rid of the T in CPT and just call it CP. So I think it's seeping somewhere. So, but anyway, so it's charge parity time. So the expansion CP tags, that's charge parity time, energy, gravity, and entropy. When you invert one, you change them all, and this applies to both matter and energy. For example, there was a paper that was called Antimatter Production at Potential Boundaries. And what it showed was that you could actually do an inversion or flipping particles inside out, like electrons, for example. So an electron can go in, get flipped, turn into a positron. So when it flips, that means that it's actually going back in time, because you're flipping the charge, you're also flipping time, energy, gravity, and entropy. Now, this is the other thing, is that in the center of every atom, in the nucleus, we have positive charge. Everything that we have chemically interacts with the electron cloud, which is in positive time. But the nucleus of every atom of our body is in negative time. Now, if you change the balance of that, and right now everything pretty much is balanced, except for there's a slight bias toward, entropy and positive time, you can actually cause that to go back. Now, interesting also to note that an electromagnetic wave, normal EM, whether it's light or RF or whatever, I mean, these waves have a positive side and a negative side. There you go. Okay, so that means that then the electric field alternates between positive and negative. But when the electromagnetic wave goes into an atom, it basically splits. That part of the wave that interacts with negative time goes to the nucleus. The other part that interacts with positive time goes to the electron cloud. So, and they don't tell you that in physics, but I mean, that's the way it works. All right, but what if you create an electromagnetic wave that has an offset to it? It's got a bias to it. So it has slightly more negative time than positive time. And you could do this through retroreflection in nonlinear crystals, for example. And they've done that with quartz crystals, and it does work there. This retroreflection basically will increase the negative time side, and then that'll interact with the matter on the outside. And this produces the healing effect.
Right. So it seems like that it says both sides are equal, there's no change. So like technically you want to stay in the state of neutrality so that you can be perfectly healthy. But when you're diseased, then it's like you need to get the positive charge so you can come back to the state of neutrality. Exactly. So technically that, can be used in both cases, right? You can make somebody more diseased or you can make somebody more healthy. You are trying, our goal is to bring them back to the state where they don't have this unbalance between the two sides of the fields.
And inside of our systems, there's a certain nonlinear component to the protoplasm inside of our cells too. So the protoplasm of our cells is also acting like a nonlinear material. So if you're pumping that, then you're producing time reversed waves, which is producing the healing effect. That's how the body heals itself.
Oh, wow.
So, so that means, and there was a book by Jerry Tennant called Healing is Voltage, and he also shows,
I have the book.
Oh yeah, I do too. It's over my bookshelf. So it's great. So anyway, it's showing that the lower the voltage, then the lower the positive healing effect can occur. So if you raise that energy level, then that internal pump wave has a higher amplitude, and then the body can produce the healing effect. We also know that that voltage declines with age. So, and it's almost like a lot of our biological systems are electrochemical batteries. In fact, even the cell acts like a capacitor in itself. So
right. And isn't it supposed to vibrate at 0.07 voltage, right? Every single cell, so it can perform the optimum, even though it's a very small voltage. But when that voltage is not there, like for example, like deafness, right? You don't have that charge, you don't have that electric charge for it to even listen to any kind of vibration coming from anywhere, which is why you're not going to be able to register that or hear, let's say.
Sure.
So that's kind of all all there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so 100 shows how we turn a transverse wave into a longitudinal wave. And these are bidirectional, by the way. So, and it's also called a galloping wave. So, and it's basically a wave that has a connection. And Tesla called it an invisible wire connecting, across space. So, and it's got a feedback system to it too. So these longitudinal waves that are created like that are happening inside of our body all the time. And that's what the longitudinal output is coming from. It's kind of like it's a bleed off. I mean, it's whatever is not internally used is basically being radiated all the time. And I think this longitudinal wave, if it's interacting with another longitudinal wave, it can actually convert back into the original transverse wave. This could be part of the mechanism for the aura goggles working.
And then the key thing that to highlight here is that we are transforming transverse wave into longitudinal wave as part of creating the healing. And then we're also using the Heisenberg compensator as in order to modulate the time domain, right? So that way,
so we're modulating
probability, right? So it's picking up the quantum collapse that's more ideal based on the intent, just like again bending the spoon.
Right. Yeah, and the time density waves will actually directly change probabilities. So that's another thing.
Right. And we already said that, and that's what this is explaining about.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, changing the probabilities, you could also, if you increase the entropy, then you can also accelerate the decay rate for radioactive elements. So that's another thing that you can do. You can also, if you shuffle the probabilities around inside of those elements, you can actually cause, what are called nucleon flipping. So you can actually do transmutation and also deactivate radioactive elements.
Right. So you are doing a physical, alchemical transmutation and transformation.
Yeah.
And I love that the last sentence there, it says, so uncertainty becomes determinism, which is where we are headed, right? So you are no longer hoping that it happens, you actually make it happen through using all these principles.
Right. Okay, so in figure 4B, that one has actually been built. It does work.
Wow.
And yes, and that's another healing modality. So again, the nonlinear medium could be any one of 3 dozen different materials now. I mean, the list is always growing, but the crystal itself can be basically just a doped quartz crystal. So, and you can also use a magnetic field to polarize the waves. And that also, it doesn't, I mean, just a couple of supermagnets can work for that. So that's it's not a big deal to do it. I mean, it's very simple. So, and the frequencies are chosen for their bioactive properties. The waves also have a negative bias in the time domain. So, for example, those two could be, it could be either in the microwave region, it could be in the optical region. Between the two, you can have between 475 and 485. You can have a beat frequency that can activate mitochondria. It can activate hemoglobin and things like that. You can do a lot of stuff with this thing. Oh yeah.
I like to highlight what beat frequency is for everybody who's listening to it, because beat frequency gets created when your frequency of your one ear is different than the other. And a lot of time when you have tinnitus or you have deafness or any kind of challenges in your hearing, that actually does actively create the beat frequency. So that's actually the plus part of those type of symptoms. So just know that because of that, you're also getting some advantage in your body, right? Like you said, it increases hemoglobin, it helps enhance
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I
mitochondria.
mean, you can key into anything. So yeah.
Yes. One thing I'd like you to highlight, Elizabeth, that this figure 4B, you said it's already been demonstrated. Can you give the example of what has been used implementing this?
Oh, a good example of this is the axis. The axis is using one frequency in 475 and another frequency in 485 into the nonlinear medium.
Okay.
So that's the best example. You can also do this with retroreflection with two frequencies going in just, I mean, you know, in one direction instead of bidirectional.
Right.
And that does work too. Quartz crystals work. Then there's other crystalline material that work. Whatever is transparent to the two frequencies you're using,
Right.
because there are certain crystals that, in the case of ND-YAG, I mean, you can't use green because green gets absorbed, for example.
Right.
So yeah. So, and I always, one of these days, I want to make a pair of glasses out of ND-YAG because it acts a lot like the Aura goggles, because you look at these things like two crystal rods, and you're seeing almost the same thing as the Aura goggles, and it makes you wonder if that's the actual mechanism for how this thing works. So yeah.
Interesting. So that could be something to perform an experiment on. So for the time being, since we've been going for a while, I think that we highlighted the concept that Tom Bearden already, you know, made it easy for us to talk
Sure.
about it. And that's what you want to use and avail in the creation of the Regen Bed, step by step. And right now you do have a very good plan on what should be the step 1 and step 2 and step 3. It needs to build on each other. The one thing that you address is the biggest concern you have right now, of course, is that the part where you want to buy a certain amount of crystal, the NDI crystal that can help you jumpstart. So that would be the starting point. So for the sake of making this video and making everybody aware of the concept, the scientific concept that are already there, which is set to implement it, and someone like Elizabeth, who already works with this, you created access. So you have the protocol in a way in the form of access, and now you want to go another step towards the Regen Bed. So this video was mainly created for us to educate everybody about what's out there and also what we would like to work on in our spare time, considering we always have so much going on. And if anybody's interested in us working on this project and they want to be our investor, then please contact us. But at the same point, you know, we are just going to keep chugging along and keep moving along, however we can go. And we wanted to give a little, what's the word, preview about into our life and what type of things Elizabeth and I share. So we appreciate everybody joining us here and listening to us talk. And any last thing you would like to say, Elizabeth?
The quote from Arthur C. Clarke comes to mind, that any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. So
100% agree. I always say that you know, magic precedes science. That's what I say, and that's what it is. And we are going to prove ultimately that everything we think it's magical right now, like that Regen Bed we're talking about, can be done by applying science. So thank
yes,
you.
absolutely.
And
Well,
everybody have a
welcome.
wonderful day.